going to talk about environmental accounting, both for countries and for companies. And we have reached the end of the cycle. I'm going to start by talking about gross domestic product and what is wrong with it. Gross domestic product is the typical, it's conventional measure of economic performance. It is used to track the economy over time and per capita used to compare economies over space. GDP was originally proposed by Simon Kuznets in 1925. You see him displayed here, and it's quite right that he won the Nobel Prize for this. But in 1932, Kuznets already emphasized that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from the measurement of national income. GDP is a measure of economic activity, and that is what it's intended for, and that is what it should be used for, as every economist knows. But that, of course, is not what it is used for, typically outside of economics. There's three ways to measure gross domestic product. One is to look at demand, to add up consumption, to public consumption, to investment. You need to add up exports and subtract imports to get a measure of gross domestic product. That is one way of looking at GDP, one way of measuring GDP. Another way is to add up value added in all the economic sectors, here agriculture, manufacturing and services, and of course VAT. Should have added that if you're looking at effective demand, you should also look at inventory changes. There's a second way of looking of measuring GDP, and the third way is to add up all income, income from labor, income from capital, and of course also income to the state. And then of course you also need to correct for that how your capital stocks have changed in value. And in theory, those three measures should add up to the same, and in this example, they add up to the same. In practice, of course, there's always measurement error, and you come up with three slightly different measures of GDP. But the important thing here is to note that GDP is a measure of economic activity. It's a measure of what is going on in the formal economy. And there's all sorts of things wrong with GDP. Robert Kennedy probably said it best.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community value in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising, and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifles and Speck's knives, and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are American.
So Kennedy is slightly dated in his references, napalm, for instance, but other things that he mentions are still current. The riot police on the street. And of course he speaks from an American perspective. Here is a list of things that are wrong with GDP if you want to take it as a measure of welfare. It's of course perfectly fine as a measure of economic activity. The first is that GDP includes investment, additions to the capital stock, but not depreciation, subtractions of the capital stock. And that implies that if you break a window, that is not counted in GDP, whereas repairing the window is. And that immediately implies that one way to boost GDP is to break as many windows as you can. This is known as a broken window fallacy, goes back to Bastiat, and that is of course the reason why we would want to look at net domestic product, which subtracts which subtracts depreciation from GDP. The problem with net domestic product is that it's harder to measure, and therefore it is typically not used, and definitely outside of economics it is often not used. A more fundamental problem with GDP is that it's limited to market transactions. That is, cleaning your house is just not part of GDP, whereas it is an important activity. Subsistence farming is also excluded. If you grow food and eat it yourself, there's no market transaction involved, and therefore it is not included in GDP. Defensive expenditure is included in GDP. So if you buy a mask or to protect yourself from air pollution, or if you buy a filter to clean your water because the water that comes out of the tap is not high enough quality, you think it's dangerous, and then those things are included in GDP because it is a market transaction. But of course you don't do this because you like these things, but you do it to prevent harm. And defensive expenditure is a market transaction, but the harm that you prevent is not a market transaction, and that is not included in GDP. Crime is criminal activities are not included in GDP. If you grow marijuana in most countries, it is not included in GDP, whereas it does. It is clearly an economic activity and it does add to economic welfare, but because it's deemed illegal, it is not included in GDP. And then finally, but most importantly for us, of course, is that anything that goes on in the natural environment is not included in GDP because it's not a market transaction. That can be negative environmental externalities are not included. If I drive my car, I produce air pollution that harms your health. That is not an economic transaction. There's no market involved. It does deteriorate your health and your well-being, but it is not included. Of course, if you go to the doctor, that is an economic transaction. If you buy medicine, that is an economic transaction. So those things are included, but the actual damaging activity is not. And of course, all the bounties we get for free from nature, recreation, enjoying ourselves on a walk, or the oxygen and water and rainfall that nature provides for free, those are not market transactions, and therefore they're not included in GDP. Other things that are not reflected in GDP is it's the gross domestic product. It accounts for all economic activity in an economy, but it does not account for the distribution of those economic activities within a country. And of course, it does not measure such things that matter for society as a whole, such as freedom and democracy. So GDP is a fine measure for economic activity, but there are many things that it does not do that we would actually like it to do, or we would like to have a measure that does these things, but GDP does it. GDP measures economic activity in the formal and legal part of the economy, and that's what it does, and it doesn't do anything more than that.